I talked about Edward Thomas in the last video. His train stopped in Adlestrop for a couple of minutes, just enough time for him to see the train station, the sign, and to take a few notes that he would use to um, write his famous poem. Jane Austen also visited Adlestrop and actually spent real time here, but it's a bit less well known. Jane's most connected, of course, to the city of Bath. She lives in Bath. Bath appears in all of her novels. Adlestrop doesn't appear in her novels, well, at least not by name, but stories of the village do appear. A bit of background on Jane Austen. All the places she lived were about 100 miles from Oxford, 100 miles north, west, and south. She was born south of Oxford in Steventon in 1775. She went to primary school in Oxford and then to Southampton. She contracted typhus and was bedridden for 18 months, and then after recovering spent an unhappy year at school in Reading between the ages of 10 and 11, and that was it. That was the end of her formal education. So she really absolutely fascinating that she has had such a incredible impact on English literature, having not done any school beyond the age of 11. And after that, she returned home to Steventon. At 26, she met a man that she might have married, but he tragically died shortly after that. And then she moved to Bath. At the age of 27, she accepted and then declined another marriage proposal. When she was 31, following her father's death, her family moved back to Southampton. And when she was 34, they relocated to a house in Chawton. Her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, was published when she was 36. And then around the time she was 41, it appears her typhus bacteria had been dormant and recurred. Her letters describe symptoms like discoloration, fever, delirium, heart, kidney, liver inflammation, headaches, joint pain. And so she spent her last 2 months in Winchester for medical care before dying at the age of 41. She's buried at Winchester Cathedral, and that is thanks to her brother's connections, not because of her status as a writer. Her books were actually popular during her lifetime, but they were published anonymously at that time. And it's her impact on the English language is even more incredible to me when I sort of consider there weren't many examples of what a novel was in the year 1800. Anyway, there's one more village that had a big influence on her that is rarely mentioned, Adlestrop. Her cousin Thomas Lee lived here, and she visited 3 times: when she was 19 in 1794, when she was 24, and when she was 31. Adlestrop is a beautiful village in the northeast corner of the Cotswolds, about 20 miles northwest of Oxford. She drew a lot of inspiration from visits and from her family members who lived here. And at least one of the scenes in Mansfield Park is inspired by her time here, but there's quite a bit more. Well, Jane and her older sister Cassandra never married, so they relied on their parents and their brothers for places to live. So whenever they moved or went somewhere, it was typically not because they wanted to go, but because it was where their family was going. She went to Adlestrop because her mother wanted to reconnect with her cousins, the Lees. The Lees' fortune was built around 1500 with the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid-1500s. The family bought Stoneleigh Abbey and the manor at Adlestrop. That's the manor. Yeah, you can still see it today. You can walk past it. There's a footpath. Jane didn't spend an awful lot of time in Adlestrop, but when she was there, she soaked up family stories and used them in her writing, perhaps making it one of the most influential places for her novels. She attended services in the village church. Well, I know of 4 points of inspiration from Adlestrop that Jane used in her writings. The first was the Wentworth story, which she used a variant of in her book Persuasion. Second is the overhaul of the landscaping around Adlestrop Park inspired some of the book Mansfield Park. The third is amateur plays at Adlestrop that have particular similarities to events that happen in the book Mansfield Park. And the fourth connection, and this one is absolutely fantastic. The character of Colonel Brandon in the book Sense and Sensibility has so many similarities to the real-life Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings was the architect, one of the architects of the British Empire in India, and was also the illegitimate father of Jane's older cousin Eliza. Jane met her cousin Eliza when she was 12 and was really inspired by her, and she met Warren when she was in Adlestrop, as he had returned home from India and lived at his family home about a mile away. I'll talk about Warren Hastings and his connection to Jane in the next video. So for this one, the three things: the Wentworth story, the landscaping, and the amateur plays. So for the first point of inspiration, Jane's mother's family, the Lees, were such a source of storytelling. Their noble aspirations and their occasionally ill-advised marriages became a real inspiration for Jane in her writings. So when Jane stayed in Adlestrop, their main hosts were the Lees, and in particular Jane's mother's two cousins, Mary and Elizabeth. Mary also wrote novels that were read around the fireplace by the family, and Elizabeth never married, but spent her time looking after Jane's aunt, who was also named Elizabeth. The elder Elizabeth died a few years before Jane's first visit to Adlestrop, but let me share a story of this elder Elizabeth and see if you can spot any familiarity to a Jane Austen plot line. So the story is Jane's aunt, the elder Elizabeth, had a mother who wanted her to marry advantageously. So when Elizabeth fell for a modest man, Lieutenant Wentworth, her mother vetoed it. Well, the two married anyway, and then Elizabeth's mother, upon hearing this, threatened to cut her off. Meanwhile, her husband went to war in France and then returned as a newly appointed Lieutenant General Wentworth. And so he was reintroduced to her mother under an assumed name. And this time around, with his newly earned rank and his victories, he won her over. And when she eventually learned the truth, all was forgiven. So this story is really similar to a story that Jane used in the novel Persuasion, as I'm sure you can tell, with a few changes. For example, Jane downgraded her version of Wentworth to a captain. There's a public path that leads through the pleasure grounds in front of Adlestrop Park. In Jane's time, this path was the main road leading into the village. The church and the parsonage at the top of the hill look very similar today to how they looked in her time. And you can walk on this path. You can see Adlestrop Park still standing today. That leads us to the second connection, James Henry's work on the pleasure grounds at Adlestrop. He did a major overhaul of the landscaping around Adlestrop Park and the old parsonage, which inspired some of the book Mansfield Park. When Jane and her family visited Adlestrop, they stayed in the parsonage, which is just across from the church on the other side of Adlestrop Park. This is the parsonage here. You can easily see it from the church. The landscaping overhaul at Adlestrop and Stoneleigh Abbey was carried out by a guy named Humphrey Repton in real life. And he appears with the very same name as the landscaper for one of the estates in the book Mansfield Park. Let me read a little bit from Mansfield Park, which Jane started about 20 years later, in that the character Henry Crawford talks about a village which is laid out very, very, very similar to how Adlestrop's laid out. He says, "I was suddenly, upon turning the corner of a steepish, downy field in the midst of a retired little village between gently rising hills, a small stream before me to be forded, a church standing on a sort of knoll to my right, which church was strikingly large and handsome for the place, and not a gentleman or half a gentleman's house to be seen, excepting one to be presumed the parsonage within a stone's throw of the said knoll and church. The farmyard must be cleared away entirely and planted up to shut out the blacksmith shop. The house must be turned to front the east instead of the north. The entrance and principal rooms, I mean, must be on that side where the view is really very pretty. I'm sure it may be done. And there must be your approach through what is at present the garden. You must make a new garden at what is now the back of the house, which will be giving it the best aspect in the world, sloping to the southeast. The ground seems precisely formed for it. I rode 50 yards up the lane between the church and the house in order to look about me, and saw how it all might be. Nothing can be easier. Well, this is from inside Adlestrop Church. James Henry's uncle Thomas performed the exact same transformation of the Adlestrop parsonage as described in the book, although later on the family changed it back. Standing at the church, we can see the parsonage today. That's currently the back of the house, the south side. But Jane would have known the front to be the area on the right here that we can see from this view. When Jane was 7, James Henry planted a cedar of Lebanon in the pleasure grounds near the house. I think this particular tree we can still see here. There's a cedar of Lebanon. I think that was from after Jane's time, though, possibly planted in the mid-1800s. But these trees can live hundreds and hundreds of years. And finally, the third point was the connection to the amateur plays. When Jane was 14, before she ever visited Adlestrop, the Lees and some visitors set up a stage in the drawing room and performed plays over 3 evenings. It was certainly an event that they conversed about with Jane and her family. And the first play that they chose, Matilda, was also performed at Jane's house a few years earlier. So the event is very similar to the one of Henry Crawford converting the billiard room into a makeshift stage in the book Mansfield Park. Well, anyway, thanks to Victoria Huxley and her book Jane Austen and Adlestrop, which I borrowed from to get a number of the stories for this video. In my last video, I talked about Edward Thomas in Adlestrop. This one, Jane Austen at Adlestrop, 120 years earlier than Edward's trip. In the next one, Jane's connection to Warren Hastings, who lived nearby, and some stories in her novels that she borrowed from him and related family members. See you then.